Hey, thanks again for joining me, students. We're now into lecture 5, so we're moving on. You hopefully just completed lecture 4 about the Holocaust. Deep, tragic, very heavy topic, obviously. All of World War II is that, and so now we're hopping into in lecture 5 the Pacific Theater, where all the fighting in the Pacific Ocean, around the Pacific Ocean against the Japanese, is basically the topic. We call that a theater of war. So in World War II, we're in Europe in that theater of war, and then also in Japan in the Pacific Ocean. So we call it the Pacific Theater. So I'll just hop right into this lecture so that I'm not taking as a lot of time. All right, I'll do my best. So in the Pacific, if you remember, Pearl Harbor happened December 7th, 1941. And so this is a map showing the extent of spread of the Japanese Empire into World War II. They started expanding in the 1930s and then continued during World War II to the point where they pushed up against us in America and our American territories. And that's one of the reasons why they want to attack us at Pearl Harbor. But you see, here's the Hawaiian Islands right here. Here's another place called Midway Island. This is going to be a pivotal battle where we start to push the Japanese back. But you see all this light pink is Japanese territory. Here's the home islands of Japan. And this still remains with Japan now, but they have lost all this pink area. So, but they even captured a little bit of Alaska. So Alaska faced some Japanese invasion. Pearl Harbor was bombed. There was no invasion there. And then Midway, they tried to attack and invade, but Alaska was really the only place that faced a Japanese invasion. Now, the state of Oregon is the only in the lower 48 states, not these territories that become states later, that was attacked in World War II. When outside of Astoria, a Japanese submarine popped up and shot its machine gun at the coastline, thinking there was a sub base there. But in fact, there was Fort Stevens, huge cannons that popped up, but they were too late to return fire before the Japanese submarine submerged and left. But we know that that was the only point where we were attacked either by the Nazis or by the Japanese on our home sort of area of the United States directly. Now, Japan did send up like weather balloons into the atmosphere that had bombs that dropped mainly on the state of Oregon and also in Idaho that were carried by the jet stream. So that's interesting bit of technology too. But I digress and move on. So our U.S. leadership, now we had 2 5-star generals. We had Eisenhower in Europe, and then in the Pacific, we're going to have another 5-star general. So we have 2 5-star generals operating over their specific theaters of war. In the Pacific Ocean, we're going to have our most well-renowned general. Now, Eisenhower is going to be very well-renowned by the end of World War II, but before World War II starts, everyone knew about General Douglas MacArthur. He's the corncob pipe, a button nose, and 2 eyes covered by aviator glasses. He always looks like this, has his corncob pipe, his aviator glasses. He made them cool before they were cool and are still around to this day. Still cool, maybe because of him and his legacy. But he becomes the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Pacific. So make sure you remember Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe. Then you got MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Pacific. His second in command, in charge of all the Navy, is Admiral Nimitz. And we now have our largest aircraft carrier in the Navy right now is named for him, the USS Nimitz. But he's our naval force commander. So he's in charge of all the Navy's aircraft carriers, battleships, etc., all the ships. So MacArthur, he's in charge of everything, including the Marines landing on beaches, as well as the navies that are on the ocean. So, and here's Nimitz pinning the Navy Cross on Dory Miller. He's one of the first African-Americans decorated in World War II, and he returned fire at the Japanese as they were bombing and attacking Pearl Harbor. He was only a ship assistant. He was assisting a captain. And so he, once the attack commenced, his commander perished, but he went then to a machine gun and returned fire on the Japanese planes. There's disputes that he shot down 1 or 2 that historians think in credit to him. Some say he didn't shoot down any. So those reports vary, but regardless of his bravery, he wins the Navy Cross, one of the first awards given in World War II and first to a person of color, which is really cool. Now, the military is a bit different than it is nowadays, but here's where the majority of the branches are going to fight. In the Pacific theater, it's going to be the Marines, because the Marines are amphibious warriors. They fight on land and sea. So they're going to be great in the Pacific, where there's lots of islands where you have to go from the sea onto land. And so they're going to be the majority branch that serves in the Pacific. And then you need the Navy to get them there via the ocean to get to these islands. In Europe, it's mainly going to be the Army, because it's a huge land mass. So the Army particularly does their fighting just on land. And of course, they need the Navy to transport them from America to get over to Europe. And there's not an Air Force at this time. That doesn't come about until the Korean War. But the Army Air Corps, so each branch had their own separate Army, or their Air Corps, like the Army Air Corps, Navy Air Corps. There's a small Marine Air Corps. There's not an Air Force. Again, that fourth branch, not counting the Coast Guard, which is also a branch of 5 branches. The Air Force gets made in the 1950s during the Korean War. So, but we're going to have Air Forces all over the place, but they're a member of different unique branches. They're not their separate one until later. And just Japan is going to take over the Pacific. You remember December 7th, 1941, that's Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. But because of the international date line, which is just west of Hawaii, so the Japanese also attacked basically the same day, same time, but it's a different date. Because of that international date line, they're going to attack other American territories west of the international date line, which is technically December 8th. So while they're attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7th, also that same day, even though it's a different day, they are, if that makes sense, they're going to be attacking other American possessions like the Philippines, Guam, other islands around the Pacific that we have a presence in. So also not just attacking us at Pearl Harbor, but a coordinated attack against American holdings and other regions as well. And so we're going to start what's called the island hopping campaign, where the Japanese have taken over all these islands, big or small, like big like the Philippines, small like Guam, and have to go island to island to recapture them and root out the Japanese military that is on these islands. We call it the island hopping campaign. Remember that for the test too. And so again, just you have larger islands like the Philippines, but you have to go basically island to island, and you can't just drive up to Japan and bomb them. They obviously have a strong Navy and somewhat strong Air Force. So you have to work your way there. And so we're going to work our way this way on a northern route, and then also through a southern route where we go down here and then swoop up this way as well. So it's kind of like a 2-pronged approach, but again, we're hopping from island to island. Guadalcanal is going to be the first island we start in the south, where the Japanese try to set up basically a landing strip so they could start attacking Australia. So it became very important for us to stop that, which we do. And then we start to push the Japanese back island to island this way. And then here in Wake Island, we stop them up north from capturing Wake Island, where they want to establish another airstrip and a refueling station for maybe an invasion of the Hawaiian Islands. So we're going to have kind of a 2-pronged approach. This way is going to take just as long as this way. You're like, there's no islands up here, but they're going to be heavily defended, and we're going to have to destroy the Japanese Navy before we can get to Japan. Down here, there's going to be more territory. So, but it actually takes about the same amount of time to go this way as it does this way, which seems kind of weird, but that's how it turned out. So the Philippines were an American possession since the Spanish-American War of 1898. We give them pretty much complete freedom as long as they protect American businesses and citizens that live in the Philippines, which they decide to do. So they're an independent country, not necessarily a territory, kind of a pseudo territory, but we had American bases there and American soldiers there as part of our agreement to protect them from other people. And so once the Japanese attacks at Pearl Harbor, they also invade into the Philippines in January 1942, and then they take control of the whole island and force the American forces there to retreat to those 2 bases, Bataan and Corregidor, and then the Japanese capture those bases and take American soldiers captive and prisoners. And so MacArthur was there. He was in the Pacific already at Bataan and Corregidor, those 2 bases, and he had to withdraw in the middle of the night, and he left to Australia, but he said, I shall return. So that's 1942. But what happens to the Americans that were captured? There's was it about 30,000, 40,000 Americans that were captured, I can't remember, with Filipino forces that were fighting with us. at the hands of the Japanese. Well, they captured us at these bases down here. This is where Bataan and Corregidor were. And then once they captured these bases and imprisoned American soldiers, they marched them to a prisoner of war camp here at Capas. So they marched really to San Fernando and then got on a train to Capas. And it's there they spent literally until the end of the war for years. And they weren't fed very well, just like rice. Uh, and and there's lots of disease and dysentery. So many Americans are going to die in the camp. But first, they had to get there and experience just the brutality of the Japanese soldier as well, in which as they're walking, like people are driving in trucks, sticking out bayonets and decapitating American soldiers, Filipino soldiers. If you looked at them wrongly, they would bayonet you to death and stab you to death or shoot you to death. Very horrible treatment of American and Filipino prisoners of war, which is going to be really infuriating to Americans for a long time. So as we start to make our slow progression to the Japanese home islands, we wanted a quick response after Pearl Harbor. If you remember, aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor during the attack by the Japanese. They were out running exercises in the ocean. And so they were spared, they were saved, they were not destroyed. And so we had the aircraft carriers. Commander James Doolittle had this great idea. He commanded one of the aircraft carriers and he got together some other captains and said, let's go on a raid to Japan. And so secretly they go and they drive the aircraft carriers off the coast of Japan and launch medium range bombers, B-25s off the flight deck, but they're so big they can take off, but they can't land on the aircraft carriers. So it's kind of like a suicide mission where you're going and you have to fly over Japan, you bomb it, and then you keep going there trying to make it to China. Parts of China were not captured by the Japanese or Russia and have be rescued there, even though maybe they would have lost their plane or maybe they could have brought their plane back. So they ended up doing that, and it was a big morale boost for Americans that were bombing Tokyo, because it had an initial response from like, yeah, we are here, we're not backing down, we're going to fight you to the end. And so huge morale boost, especially after Pearl Harbor, to have this little victory. The Battle of Midway, as I just mentioned, is going to be kind of like our turning point in the Pacific, because we stop Japanese aggression and now start resisting them. The Japanese go on defense and try to protect all those territories that they've spread to. But we need it as a Navy base. It has an airfield there, refueling station for our ships, and kind of like a halfway midway point, Midway Island, between us and America and Hawaii on the way to Japan. And this becomes the first major defeat of the Japanese. Guadalcanal is that island I just mentioned. It's known as the Island of Death because it's really the first time we resist the Japanese on an island. So it becomes the first major offensive in the Pacific. We didn't have naval superiority at the time. They had an air force that we necessarily didn't. So we literally dropped off troops and said, good luck to you, go destroy the Japanese on this island and capture it. But we really didn't have the resources to be able to protect them and take care of them. So that's why it's called the Island of Death. A lot of Americans are going to perish there, become casualties. But we had to stop the Japanese here so that they would not invade Australia, which is what the Japanese were trying to do in capturing this island. So, and now I'm hopping forward. Those are some major battles. I have a couple more still to cover. I'm going quick. So I'm going from 1942 basically to 1944. There's going to be a lot of pivotal battles. Some of them you can look up on your own. But we are going to make it back to the Philippines 2.5 years after MacArthur left it. So we recapture the U.S. bases that were there, Bataan and Corregidor, and then seek to root out the Japanese in the Philippines from there. And we wanted to protect our prisoners of war, so we sent Allied paratroopers in behind enemy lines to rescue, to make sure, because the Japanese had these kill orders that if they were afraid that prisoners of war were going to be recaptured and taken back, they had these kill orders that they were just going to kill all the prisoners and in their life right then and there. So we had to send in secret forces to go protect them so the Japanese would not kill our prisoners of war. One of the most famous battles in the Pacific is the Battle of Iwo Jima. This is the name of an island, and it's a couple hundred miles off the coast of Japan, so very pivotal in order to build airstrips on it. There was 3, and then be able to use our big bombers to fly over Japan and start bombing major cities of Japan to make them surrender. So by September 1945, we had to capture this island and so we could secure a spot for airfields for our long-range bombers called B-29 super fortresses. And it became famous for this picture right here, the raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. And so it's one of the most iconic photos in American history. And so you see these soldiers, after capturing this part of Iwo Jima, the island, they climbed to the top, which then gave them range to continue to attack the Japanese that remained on the island. But they raised this flag, and there was a member of Life magazine. He was there photographing. He was a war correspondent, and the flag was standing up. He's like, "Oh, I missed it. Hey, take it down and raise it back up." So it's not the original flag raisers, but it was just 5 guys that happened to be standing around when this photographer got there. So they took the flag down and then put it back up while the photographer took this picture. And very famous. And all these guys basically got taken away from battle, from the field of battle, so that they could then go and raise money for war bonds throughout America. And a lot of them were really upset about that. One of the most famous is Ira Hayes. He was a Native American that was fighting in World War II. And he ended up, once he came back to America, he became an alcoholic and passed away from liver failure because he could not really stand the thought of being away from the front where his friends were still fighting, but he was back trying to raise money and had a lavish life in America. So, and Johnny Cash wrote a song about him. But again, so we're moving south. We talked about Guadalcanal. We're going to go this way. And by 1944, we've recaptured the Philippines. Then we got a northern sort of prong. We're going from Wake Island and capturing all these other islands on our way to Japan. So here's Iwo Jima right here, and Saipan, some other, and Tinian, some other important islands. So from here, we can launch bombing campaigns over the major cities of Japan to try to bomb them in submission. And then we're coming from this way. So we capture the Philippines, we'll go to Formosa, and then Okinawa is another famous island that we capture so we can start bombing from the south. You see, it's a lot closer to Japan than Iwo Jima is. So we're just inching closer island by island. And so that's the next one. By April 1st, 1945, we're going to try to capture the island of Okinawa. We actually still have a U.S. military base there. And it's this time that we start seeing the Japanese get super desperate. So they start to use suicide pilots called kamikaze, which means divine wind. They had resisted the Chinese from invading the Japanese home islands in the 1500s, I believe, 1500s. And so they knew that we were coming to invade the Japanese home islands. So they wanted to stop us, just like had happened when they resisted China. So they called themselves, we're this divine wind, these pilots that are going to pack our planes with TNT and fly into ships to destroy them so that the Americans don't invade the Japanese home islands. But we do eventually capture Okinawa, and it sets the stage for eventually an invasion of Japan, which we estimate is going to involve at least 2 million Americans. And maybe we're going to have half of them be casualties, because we know the fighting against Japanese civilians as well as the military left on the home islands is going to be very intense, because the Japanese never surrendered. That was the most dishonorable thing to do. And so here's like the Okinawa island. And this is important to remember. Every island that we had to capture had tremendous logistical challenges to get men on the island to fight and then bring material and tanks and artillery and other reinforcements, food, tents to sleep in. And so this has to happen hundreds of times because there's hundreds of islands in the Pacific. In Europe, it just happened once in the invasion of D-Day in Normandy. But here in the Pacific, it has to happen hundreds of times. And now it's a smaller landmass and you're using not as great of forces as D-Day, but still you had to do it. And it's going to be something that happens on a regular occurrence in the Pacific. So as we get to the last year of the war, our big 3 world leaders are going to meet. Of Great Britain, it's Churchill. Of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, our president. And then from the Soviet Union, who is also a friend and ally at this time, is Communist Russia, the USSR, is Joseph Stalin. And so they're going to meet in the last year of the war a couple of times, the first time at Yalta, but they're going to agree we can't have another world war like this ever again. So they agree to establishing the United Nations, basically redoing the League of Nations after World War I to try to make it stronger and better and force every country in the world to comply so that we could talk out our differences and not have a rise of dictators again that want to destroy the world. We decided how to occupy Germany. Once Germany is destroyed in May of 1945, it will be destroyed. And then we get compelled the Soviet Union to help us in the Pacific against the Japanese 3 months after the war in Europe is over, because we need assistance. It's just us fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific. And in exchange for their help, they'll get South Korea some islands in Manchuria, which mainly does not happen because we end up dropping atomic bombs and ending the war in the Pacific before the 3-month time period is up. And in between the war being over and that meeting, FDR is going to pass away. He's going to have like a stroke. And so on April 12th, 1945, our only president to be elected 4 times dies just 1 month into his last term, his 4th term. He's our only president to get elected 4 times. Then we pass a constitutional amendment. You can only be elected twice. So that's why former President Trump got elected once, and he's like saying he might run again in 2024. He can, but he can only do it 2 times. And I'm sure Joe Biden would run for re-election and stuff too. So, but here's his casket going through Washington, D.C. Really sad. He got us through the Great Depression, right? Through most all of World War II. And then the year of victory, 1945, he's not there because it's just 1 month later, he's going to experience, or America will experience, victory in Germany. And by August, victory in Japan. So he dies within literally 4 months of seeing the end of World War II. So pretty sad for many Americans. And so his vice president is Harry Truman, who takes over. He came from owning a newspaper. And so he's going to be a lot different than FDR. More people think he's more moderate, whereas FDR was a lot more liberal. And so helped FDR win the election in 1944. But what Truman's going to come to find out in sort of a secret, no one knew about it, only like 6 people in the White House, not even the vice president, Harry Truman, knew about it, is we were developing a top secret project to make the world's most top secret weapon, which the project was called the Manhattan Project. And it's going to develop the first nuclear/atomic bomb ever in world history. Now, we knew the Nazis were trying to get it, which is what compelled Einstein and Slizard to write President Roosevelt a letter that said, hey, you need to build an atomic bomb because the Germans are trying to build it. We got to build it before they do, or else we're going to get wiped off the face of the earth by them. And so this compelled FDR to authorize the largest, most secret project in American history, which is the Manhattan Project, at a cost of $2 billion, which is extremely expensive. It's close to what is it, like $900 billion of today's money? You could look it up, from 1945 dollars to today's money. But they're going to produce 3 atomic weapons. So one was made just to test to make sure that this worked and that we didn't vaporize every oxygen molecule, and the atmosphere didn't open up and vaporize us. So we tested one in New Mexico, and on July 16, 1945. And so we had 2 nuclear weapons remaining. So one of those 2 we quickly got across the Pacific Ocean. So you see the timeline from July to 3 weeks later to August. We get this bomb loaded on the Enola Gay, this B-29 super fortress, and we drop it on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. And the nickname for that bomb was Little Boy. It was named that because it was tall and cylindrical in shape. We were testing out sort of the perfect sort of prototype, how to make the atomic bomb deadly through its design. And it was dropped from Enola Gay. The plane was manned by Paul Tibbets. His mom's name was Enola Gay Tibbets, so that's why his plane was Enola Gay. And so utter devastation within 1.5 square miles. Everything is kind of just like knocked down. People are straight vaporized. And you see this woman, she has burns. This was the outline of her dress. It's like a plaid design, which got burned into her back. You see her neck is severely burned. So if you're close enough, you got really bad burns. If you're still farther away, you might live, but you might die of radiation poisoning, which they called bomb sickness. And so we didn't really know or study and have a good understanding of radiation at the time. Now we do. And it's why these areas still have high incidences of cancer, because of all the radiation that has existed there since 1945. Then 3 days later, we wait for Japan. Hey, are you going to surrender? We got tons of these bombs, which is just a bluff. We only had 1 more. We didn't say that. Hey, we got 1 more bomb we're going to drop on you. We said, hey, we got dozens more. We're going to keep coming and bomb all your cities. Are you going to surrender yet, and they didn't. We gave them 3 days. They didn't surrender. We didn't even hear from them. So we dropped our third and last bomb that we had developed, and it would have taken 3 more months to develop some more. But we dropped the third bomb on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. And that bomb's name was Fat Man because it was a circle. So not a cylinder like a little boy, but Fat Man was a cylinder, which was the more effective bomb design of the two. And so you see what happened in Nagasaki, pretty much like Hiroshima, just straight leveled. There's nothing left. People aren't left. Tremendous radiation and exposure to radiation causing cancer if you don't die of the blast and then the burns. And so this, now you can go there. This survives. This was pretty close to the epicenter of where the bomb detonated. And so this is left. This is now an atomic bomb like memorial, as well as museums. You can go there, and they basically advocate for getting rid of nuclear weapons worldwide. And they have a goal that will happen by 2050. So getting rid of all nuclear weapons so we never have this threat, and so that never has to happen to anyone again. So what are the effects of these two bombs? Well, in Hiroshima, we estimate about 70,000 killed instantly. There's other estimates that it's 100,000. By the end of that year, it's going to be 140,000 Japanese civilians that are going to die. It's civilians. There were military men there, but it's mainly a civilian population. And then in Nagasaki, again, 100,000 dead or injured. We estimate with another hundreds of thousands poisoned in total and dying prematurely. People are losing hair. People are going to have their organs really kind of regenerated and deformed. It's not going to be pretty in the years following. That's why every year on August 6th, August 9th, it's part of a celebration where they're making thousands of paper cranes in Japan to celebrate, and each crane represents the lives lost. Over 300,000 plus, if you include all the cancer victims that have died since then. So tremendous festival. It's on my bucket list to get there. So why are we going to drop these atomic bombs? We make this incredibly devastating weapon, and then we use it. Well, the most important thing is we wanted to end the war. We wanted to end World War II. And so we were planning for an invasion of Japan, but we knew there was going to be millions of Americans involved in that. With an estimated range, it could have been 500,000 up to 2 million US casualties, dead, wounded, missing through the invasion of Japan properly. So here we have this bomb. 200, 300,000 people are going to die, but that's far less than the 2 million American casualties. So of the 2 million, usually we have like a third of them are deaths. So even if we had 2 million casualties of the 2, 3, 4 million Americans that are going to have to invade, that would be still 600,000 Americans that would lose their lives invading the Japanese home islands. So it would have been tremendously bloody and chaotic and awful for both sides. Because, so it would have not been pretty. So our war planners, including FDR, who authorized the atomic bomb and initially set it up, Truman made the decision to drop the bomb, saw, hey, it's going to be far less casualties if we just drop these two bombs, they surrender, than having us invade the Japanese home islands. Number two, we wanted to limit the role of Russia in the war because we knew, we wanted the help, but once they got involved, any territory they took over, they were going to keep, just like they had already done in Europe with Poland and Eastern Germany and different things. So we didn't want them to have a large role and therefore take over more territory. And that's going to demonstrate our strength of the United States, setting the stage for the Cold War, of us being like, hey, we got these bombs, don't mess with us. Well, Russia had spies, Soviet Union had spies into our Manhattan Project. So they were developing their own secret atomic bombs too, and are going to have one within a year. And so number four, the bomb was a weapon less deadly than some attacks in Japan or Germany were going to be. Just as I mentioned, the invasion would have been tremendously costly in terms of lives for both sides. So this was going to be the more efficient answer. That's why we dropped the bomb. Very, very disputed to this day. A lot of historians critique Truman for allowing and ushering in the atomic age. And people during that time in the 40s largely just cheered Truman. They cheered the end of the war because it was a tremendously devastating war for America too, not as much as other countries in Europe and against the Japanese, but many people just wanted the war over and saw that as a conclusion of war. So we're happy with it. And so we have what's called VJ Day, where we see the end of the Japanese Empire. Their surrender happens on August 10th, 1945. So it's called VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. And Emperor Hirohito, so it's just one day after Nagasaki that we do get a response from Japan and they surrender by Hirohito. The Emperor Tojo is still in command, but he's not authorized to do anything. He's going to be hung eventually for war crimes. But Hirohito tells his people not to resist the Americans. And so they do surrender, lay down arms. It's going to be very difficult for the Japanese military and civilians to do that, to surrender, because it's the most dishonorable thing, but they did so. Then we occupied Japan for 10 years and have become close friends ever since. So, but on September 2nd, 1945, this is the official like VJ Day. This is when Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. I've been on the ship. It's in Hawaii now. If you ever go there, the Pearl Harbor Memorial, and they have a plaque right underneath that says, "This is the spot where Douglas MacArthur and the Japanese military ambassador signed the surrender to America." So pretty cool experience. I encourage you to do so. Also in Hawaii, they have this punch bowl cemetery where anyone that died in World War II in the Pacific could have been buried here. Not everyone. A lot of people came back to the States and were buried here, but many veterans that died in World War II were buried here. It's an old Hawaiian cemetery that got taken over by the American military. And so we started burying our dead here too. And also those that die in Korea and also in Vietnam, we have remains of veterans that perished in those wars as well here in the Punch Bowl. So just a couple of pictures. I've been there, pretty spectacular. Here's an aerial of it. So it's this volcano that basically collapsed. And so you have like this huge cemetery area. So here's like the top, here's where I'm taking the picture from, out this way. So pretty powerful, pretty incredible. It's like Arlington, but the Arlington of Hawaii or the Pacific Ocean. So, and then they have names of people interred there all over the place, of course. And so World War II is over. The heroes are going to be welcomed back. Tens of millions of Americans are going to serve. I won't say tens, but a tremendous number of Americans are going to serve in the military, and so now be able to come home. War's over, and who's left pretty much unscathed? America, right? We don't have our infrastructure destroyed. We're never attacked within our country proper itself in the lower 48 states. So we're going to usher in a new era in the world and really be the leading leader of it for American capitalism and democracy. And then also the Soviet Union are going to have tremendous loss, but they're also going to be a victor too, and have tremendous territory and resources to continue to expand. They're going to spread their communist, socialistic ideals throughout the world. And so that's going to bring us to a head into our next unit, which is going to be the Cold War, in which we're going to technically fight against each other without really fighting. So that's the next unit we get to. So here's this chart. This is our last slide, talking about what each country had in terms of military deaths and civilian deaths. So you see a total deaths, civilian, like for this other, well, just go to the Soviet Union. So here's the Soviet Union military deaths, tremendously high because they didn't care about their people and just threw them out to the front to go die. But over 10 million military men are going to die. And then another about 13 million civilians are going to die. Again, they were stuck in these war zones. The Soviet Union could care less about their own people for the most part. So that's why they're going to have literally close to 24 million people, military and civilian, die in World War II. So what a percentage of the population is that? Well, that's this blue. So it's over 13% of the Soviet Union's population is going to die in World War II. So that's one of the tragic things about communist countries. They just don't care about human life that much. So yeah. So go fight a war and die. So, but that's Stalin too, and his influence. You see Germany is going to lose over 5 million military deaths. They have another like 2 civilian deaths. So what percentage? It's close to 11% of their total population. Whereas America, though, we are really minuscule, right? So our military deaths is going to be believe it's 250,000 military deaths. I could be wrong on that. I believe it's close to that. And we don't have any civilians die. We have a handful in Oregon that come upon a bomb that was dropped by a balloon and they detonate it and the whole family of 4 dies. But literally there's no civilian deaths because no one's getting attacked here. In Hawaii, we had about 60 in the attack on Pearl Harbor. So very few civilian deaths and military deaths. Like we, uh, did our part to try to not die. So what percentage of the population? It's 0.25% of American population died during World War II. So we're literally pretty much unscathed, uh, and did very well in terms of other countries. So you see Allied civilians are going to die. This is mostly Soviet Union, uh, Allied military, so America included. And then the Axis, they're going to have a lot of loss of life too, but not as much as the Allies. Okay. So hopefully that was interesting to you. Thanks for staying with me for so long. We are wrapping up the fighting that happens in the Pacific. We're not talking about fighting anymore. When I see you for the next lecture, we're going to talk about what's going on in America during World War II, tremendous changes to America. And then the following lecture, our last one, number 7, is going to be on the following Monday, Tuesday after midwinter break. And we're going to talk about sort of the Japanese American internment, as well as the fighters that come out of these camps to fight. And one of the most decorated units of all of World War II, the 442nd. So thanks for staying, taking notes. Have a great weekend. Good week.